right. Okay, well, it looks like we've got a good group coming in here. So thanks everyone for coming. I'll go ahead and get us started. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jenny Koch, and I'm the project manager for Cville Plans Together. I introduced myself, even though most of the steering committee members know me, but we have at least 60 folks watching this tonight. So if you haven't been to one of these before, thanks for coming. I do want to note that tonight's meeting is a steering committee meeting. So our main purpose tonight is to hear from the steering committee members, but we do, you know, we're glad that folks are here to watch, and we will have some time for comments at the end of the discussion, at the end of the meeting. But I do want to note that there's also a webinar on the 25th. So if you would like a chance to provide more Q&A that for those who are attending who aren't steering committee members, you may want to consider attending that as well, or instead of today. But with that being said, I guess before we jump in, just a reminder, introduction for the steering committee folks and others who is here talking to you tonight. So in addition to myself, from the consultant team, we have Ron Sessoms, who is with Roadside and Harwell, Dina Roadside with Roadside and Harwell, and LaToya Thomas with Brick and Story. We also have Lee Einsweiler from Code Studio. So with that being said, Ron, would you like to pull up the slides and we can go ahead and get started? For those of you who are watching, you can also access these slides if you go to cvilleplans-together.com on the Documents and Materials page under Steering Committee.
Yeah, it won't let me share my screen.
One moment.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's try now. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Ron. So if you go to the next slide, please. Tonight's meeting, the purpose of tonight's meeting is to walk through some of the work we've done since we met last in March and talk about the chapters and the draft land use map that are out now for community review. We'll also touch on some of the next steps that are coming. And then, as I mentioned, we will have some time at the end, I hope, for some taking some comments and questions from non-steering committee members who are in attendance tonight. I do also want to note that we are recording this meeting, so it will be posted on our website, as are the other steering committee meetings that we've had. This will be our 7th meeting, I believe. So if you go to the next slide, thanks, Ron. This is our current schedule. In the pink, we've outlined some of the sort of updates and things that we've done since the last time we had a full public engagement period. But we met with you on March 8th. And so we've talked through some of these with you already. As you know, the Affordable Housing Plan, which had a lot of feedback from all of you, was endorsed by Council on March 1st. And then we met with you on the 8th. So we did confirm that with you last time we met. But since we last met with you, we have been working hard to update the guiding principles for the comprehensive plan, as well as the vision statements, which we reviewed in the community process in November. And we've also made updates to the rest of the chapters of the document. That includes updates to the goals and strategies that are identified to address the guiding principles and vision statements, to work us toward those endpoints. And we've also developed a draft future land use map. So those are really the two big things that we'll be discussing with you tonight. And they are the major focus of the month of May, where we have several events going on to get input from the entire community. So Ron, if you go to the next slide. I'll also show this at the end, but just to note, especially for those of you who may be watching who are not on the steering committee, we are encouraging everyone to review these materials, the chapters, and the draft future land use map, and provide your input. This is a draft map. And so we're reaching out to all of you to see what you think. You can go to this website, cvilleplans-together.com/engage3. We, as I noted, have a webinar on the 25th next week, but there is one that's recorded from the 10th. We had many pop-up meetings this past weekend, as well as one the previous weekend. So we gathered a lot of input from folks at that point, both on paper and just in discussions we had. And we would encourage everyone to go online and submit, your input on the comment form and or on the interactive map, which you can drop a pin and tell us what you think about site-specific things on the land use map. You can also submit comments via the toll-free phone line or via email. And we'll show that information again at the end of the presentation. But to get into the real meat of what we will be discussing today, I want to go into the comprehensive plan updates. And so first thing we'll want to talk about is the chapters. There are 7 topic-specific chapters in the comprehensive plan. We've spoken with you about these chapters before in the context of developing the vision statements for each of these in the fall. So as I mentioned, what we're working on gathering input on now is the goals and strategies within each of these chapters. So as we mentioned, there's a vision statement for each of these topics in the document, and that was informed by the input we got over the past year. And then to reach those vision statements or to reach those priorities for the future, we have proposed some draft goals and strategies that we think can help get us there. There's also within each of the goals, or with each of the goals, there is some potential measures of progress that can be used to determine, how the city is progressing on addressing each of those goals. So we on today's call, we won't go through each of the chapters in great detail. That would be a lot, but I do encourage you, both the steering committee and anyone else who's watching, to look closely at the chapters and send your feedback. We want to know if you think we're missing strategies and goals that could help us to achieve the vision statement, or if you think there's a piece of the vision that we're not addressing in a goal, for example. That's the kind of feedback we'd love to get. So please do take a look at that and send your comments. If you go to the next slide, I want to note that, as I mentioned, we've talked with you about the guiding principles for the document in the past, and they are listed here. I just want to reiterate these before we go through some of the major updates to the chapters, because these are really meant to, these guiding principles are meant to be connectors throughout the entire plan. They're meant to identify major community priorities that we heard a lot about over the past year. And we fully recognize, there are folks in the community who, may not have been aware of this process that was going on. And we've been working hard to reach folks, but we know it's been quite a year. So if you have thoughts you'd still like to share on these and you haven't yet, we're happy to take that input as well. But we've worked to try to work to make sure that these are incorporated throughout the document. So with each of the goals, it not only has those measures of progress I talked about, but it also says which one or more of these guiding principles it addresses. So I'll just note each of the headings here. You can see equity and opportunity, community culture and unity, local and regional collaboration, environmental stewardship and sustainability, and then connections and access. Those are the big ideas. The text you see here is just sort of the headline, and then each of them has a little bit more text with it within the draft chapter. But if you go to the next slide, Ron, we want to talk briefly through some of the, what I'll call some of the major updates to the chapters. One of the biggest updates that happened with these chapters is that there is a new chapter called Community Engagement and Collaboration. And this focuses on looking forward to other planning processes that are happening in the city, identifying ways to create standardized processes for engagement that really look to seek representative input from the community. It also emphasizes ways to look for ways to partner with community groups and residents, including through neighborhood associations, for example, and using a full range of opportunities to engage with folks. We've been doing a lot of virtual engagement through the past year, and we don't anticipate that will completely go away as we move forward. But we also know it's really nice to speak with people in person. You know, we enjoyed going out for the pop-ups this weekend and getting to see people face to face. I'd also like to note some updates that we made to the Land Use, Urban Form, and Historic and Cultural Preservation chapter. One of those major updates, obviously, is the draft future land use map. And we'll be talking more about that today, that lives inside that chapter. But the chapter also incorporates strategies and goals for ensuring or helping to ensure that the implementation of the future land use map is really tied to equity and affordability, which, as you all know, are some of the key priorities that were identified for us in this process. The land use chapter also really looks for ways to support a mix of uses and increase housing options, especially those that are sort of walkable and accessible to folks throughout the city. And it also, in making these updates, we combined the land use chapter with the previous urban design and historic and cultural we combined the land use chapter with the urban design and historic preservation chapter that were in the previous plan. And as part of doing that, we've been able to identify ways that historic properties can, have a role in addressing this housing need in the city, as well as, the preservation of them as a community asset. The last chapter I would identify, I'll talk about right now, is the housing chapter. And that chapter had a lot of changes. We incorporated the recommendations from the Affordable Housing Plan, including all of those related to funding, governance, tenants' rights, and subsidies. The only recommendations from the Affordable Housing Plan that are not in the housing chapter are those that were related to land use, which have been incorporated into the Land Use, Urban Form, and Historic and Cultural Preservation chapter. And again, the housing chapter really tries to support a range of housing options throughout the city. It also incorporates, looking at, I believe, energy efficiency, as well as strategies to address homelessness in the city. So I want to pause here for a second. And I know I've been talking at you for a bit, but we want to hear from you all as well on the steering committee. So were there any questions or comments about the chapter updates that you'd like to share? And I can't see everyone, so you may want to use the raise your hand function if you do want to. Sorry, and just to reiterate, we're just looking for input from the steering committee at this point, though we will be taking comments from others in attendance at the end of the meeting. Let's see. Jeanette, would you like to share your comments?
Sure, thank you. We had talked somewhat about changing the title of the climate and food access chapter to represent something that was a little bit broader than just food access, potentially food systems or food equity. And I was just wondering if that was still a consideration.
Yes, I think that is something we can still consider. And I recall we did speak about that chapter. I think we want to be as representative as we can be of the strategies that are in that chapter and whatever the major goal is. So we'd certainly welcome your feedback, given your specialized expertise in that area on that.
Okay, thanks. The hope is that it's broader than food access, which is kind of a temporary short-term solution, and create it into more systemic change for the city. So.
Got it. Thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you.
Let's see. Michael, would you like to share your comments?
Yeah, just a thought I had is somewhat similar to that with the economic prosperity and opportunity. I know it mentions community wealth building in the update, but I still wonder whether, it may make more sense for the chapter itself to be focused on community wealth building. Again, to try to gear that chapter towards more systemic change, thinking about how things like community land trusts, community development corporations, community gardens all interconnect as a system for wealth creation that's different than the normal way of doing economic development. And I do know there's a number of localities that have offices of community wealth building or, national organizations focusing on that kind of thing. So I think there may be an opportunity there for us to really open that up towards a broader, more systemic approach that I think will also connect directly with the housing piece as well.
Thanks. I just want to make sure I fully understand your comments. So are you thinking maybe potentially calling the chapter something that's more reflective of that, and then adding, are there additional strategies as well that you think we need to add?
Yeah, I think,
Okay.
Having that be the title and then incorporating these community wealth building strategies into it really in a systemic, interconnected way.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Let's see here.
I believe Christine is next.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, yeah.
All right, great. I'm really encouraged, and I know that it's one of the guiding principles and is really important, but I'm really encouraged to see how often regional strategies and regional networks are noted in this. One thing I would love to encourage is while it's in the guiding principles, it's not really in the implementation notes as like potential partners, that the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission could be a potential partner in a lot of these strategies. Specifically since the TJPDC does house the Charlottesville Albemarle MPO. It also has the Regional Transit Partnership and the Regional Housing Partnership. So I think it would be really beneficial to include the PDC as partners in all of those initiatives that we're currently working on in a regional manner.
Agreed. I think that's a great idea, Christine. And we can try to identify those, but it'll be good to check in with you on that too, to make sure we're fully reflecting what you're thinking. So thank you for that. Diane, looks like you're next.
Great, thanks. With regard to the chapters, the chapter 1 on land use, I think when you present the work, the land use plan to the public, to us, and to the various public Zooms and other forum, you don't really touch on some of the, or bring the goals forward and how they inform the plan. And I'm thinking in particular of goal 2, protect and enhance the existing distinct identities of the city's older neighborhoods while promoting housing options, a mix of uses and sustainable uses in the community. And further go to, promote context sensitive planning to maintain and enhance the distinct identities. And I think that that's not coming out in the discussion about the land plan, in particular, when neighborhoods look at the intentions of low and medium intensity residential. And I note that in some of the discussion yesterday was very informative in terms of what is aspirational and what is actually codifiable. And Lee acknowledged that zoning code cannot dictate taste and quality and aesthetics. And so addressing how the principles will be brought forward to inform, what is actually going to be incorporated into code and what is aspirational. And I noted when I went through the document that the language differs from chapter to chapter. And I noted this in a comment to you the other day that I sent, that even on the summary of the issues here under land use and preservation, recognize, support, where housing is incorporated, just the build on, the more intentional language. And I think that if the public is actually printing these documents and reading it, there's going to be some confusion in what is enforceable and what is guidance. I also noted in transportation, the proposed densities that are allocated along corridors are likely to require road improvements, either widening for a turning lane, if not further. And while the guidance is recommending multimodal strategies, et cetera. That's going to take time and funding to implement, and that's been a long struggle for a lot of improvements over time for those of us who've been in the city. So I think that while I understand that the plan at this point is a high-level document, it should address the and provide guidance for how those improvements, such as widening and enhanced traffic, are going to be addressed. Again, I appreciate that they'll take engineering studies to really understand the impact, but the guidance that you're providing, the principles that you're providing, should also include how will we go about implementing the required infrastructure improvements to carry the additional density.
Thanks, Diane. I think those are all great comments. And I just wanted to note, you had mentioned a meeting that we had yesterday. Just for those of you who were not at that meeting, we met with representatives from the Neighborhood Leaders Group, which are a neighborhood association representatives. So to speak to your comments, I think you're right. We've been in talking about the land use map. When we talk with people about it, for example, at the pop-up meetings, we were talking about how, scale can be sort of context dependent, and that, we're showing a range of land on the land use map that, will have to sort of respond to what's adjacent to it. Lee, did you want to say anything else about the sort of the land use piece that Diane raised?
I'm not certain that we have a whole lot of the answers. We're hoping we could work through things at the more generalized level of the future land use map, and then begin to craft the strategies for implementing those tools. I think perhaps one of the key things that has not come across is that this is not the zoning map. That there would be variation underneath a single, color on the map. There would be, 2, 3, 4 implementing zoning districts that might all have appropriate strategies for different parts of the community. But those can't quite be figured out until we can understand where they're likely to be applied. So we need at least a pretty solid draft of the future land use map before we begin our analysis. So right now we are thinking we'll have that hopefully within the month, and then be able to move on to the stage of describing to people what those districts might be before we actually draft them. So there will be another stage at which we get to talk about that relationship between the future land use plan and the zoning districts, but it comes a little further on. I agree that neighborhoods are very interested in that detail, and I understand that. So we simply need to get beyond the stage that we're in now.
Can I comment one more comment, please, on that?
Yeah.
Yesterday, in the different slides, you had one slide that said the zoning code must follow the land use plan, and then you said later that it influences it. And I believe the correct word is must, that in Virginia, in Charlottesville, the land use plan does directly inform and must inform the zoning map and the zoning code. And that came up in a discussion, if you recall, when Kay Slaughter was a participant in a Zoom call a month or two ago. She's a former mayor and a retired land use attorney, and I'm confident she understands both process and land use law. And so it's really important to be clear about that and let the public understand that yeah, we do need a more refined draft plan to comment on, because it will direct the zoning map, and because the consultants are asking for by right approval, these zoning codes will have heavy significance. And so when the final land use plan comes forward, it's going to be it's going to be a direction that needs to be understood. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that, be transparent about it, and to be clear to the public, because I think, as you know, the vagueness is not helping people's confidence in the plan.
Okay, thanks, Diane. The other thing I want to note is I think there will be an implementation chapter that will be part of the plan, and I think that will be a location where that could potentially identify more clearly the process for looking at things like transportation improvements, which should include multimodal improvements. I know we've talked a lot about, or previously we talked about the need for making sure some of these corridors, for example, are not currently walkable in a way that feels safe for folks, or that is safe. And if we're encouraging additional potential development or density, that needs to be addressed along with that. So I think that's identified at a high level in the chapter, but I think we can identify some more explicit next steps in the implementation piece. And to your point about language differing from chapter to chapter, or differing maybe between the sort of intentional language, as you may mention, sort of on the slides versus in the chapters, I think you're right, that needs to be consistent, and that we need to be clear in the document about what, when it comes to land use, what is enforceable and what is guidance. And so we will work to make that more clear.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Let's see. I think Peter has his hand raised. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. So my comment was sort of related to that one, actually, and I'll try to thread a couple of things together, and I'm sorry if it comes out too complicated. It'll relate to both the process and the content. So especially the land use map, but also the chapters have a vagueness and a bit of mystery that I think is very frightening to a lot of people. And I think it's also, it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. So one of the questions I get when I talk to people all the time is how many people are we building for? And I just have to, sort of raise my hands. I could hypothesize a couple of different numbers of added population. And so that's sitting on one side. Our current comprehensive plan, the second page of the land use chapter is a build out analysis. And so I've heard already that, like, this thing isn't final, and there's things about implementation, and right now it is so tentative. You can't say, well, this is how many units we'll have in 2040. But I think it can be done iteratively. It is knowable how many units could be built in the scenario that's in front of us. And so maybe from a process perspective, as we move closer, we see with much more clarity, where this thing is going. The problem, though, with that is that holding the discussion about the implications until the map is done, it doesn't allow people to make meaningful cost-benefit decisions. So that, those two things are there. And then also, I'll just say from a perspective of someone who's working in the transportation space, but it applies to all of the infrastructure. Charlottesville and Albemarle too have consistently said, we're gonna do things and then we're gonna, build out the infrastructure, we'll retrofit the stuff that we need. That's why we don't have sidewalks. We built houses before there was an idea for sidewalks. So the implementation has to actually happen in advance of of the change or at a very minimum along with the change. It can't be like, you know, we add a whole bunch of people to streets and then we will consider applying for smart scale grants or something like that. That's how we got where we are. And I know it's not an easy thing to solve, and I appreciate the hard shovel work that you guys are doing. But I just thought I'd throw those out as a perspective, something to consider.
Thanks, Peter. I think, you know, we've certainly been hearing, I know at the pop-ups, we heard a lot of concerns about, again, sort of what Diane was mentioning as well, those making sure that transportation, you know, multimodal transportation is prepared to handle any additional people that may be living along corridors. And so I think that, again, perhaps needs to be clarified in the implementation piece, how that may work in terms of with land use. In terms of the, I want to mention with the build out scenario that's in the current comprehensive plan, I believe that's the build out of the current zoning at that time, as opposed to the land use map.
Yeah, that's correct. But if we get a approved land use map and then start to think about how many people we want, it's too late. Like we have to be thinking about the two simultaneously.
Well, we will. We have not set a particular number, as you know, of people, and you're not the only one who has asked us what that number would be. And I think we, as a team, can put our heads together and figure out the best way to display that. It will involve several assumptions for different categories and whatnot, but we can work on ways to do that. Let's see. Ashley, would you like to speak?
Yes, I just wanted to echo Peter's comments. I think it would help us really better understand maybe some of the best locations to put people if we had an idea of, okay, here's how much growth we are anticipating. I do think in the past we've not done the best job of having the infrastructure ready for growth. So I agree with that as well. And, you know, I think that you're starting to hear from a bunch of neighborhoods now that are maybe feeling a little, I don't know, maybe upset. I don't know what the word would be about the current land use plan. And I do think we should, as I suggested previously, really cut the map up into quadrants. I think your online tool is great because you can really zoom in and get up close in the various areas. But I think it would be helpful for neighborhoods if you guys could find a way to kind of, we have the overall land use plan, but I think a lot of neighborhoods would appreciate like a PDF just of their area so they can really dig in. I think people are hungry to give you all feedback that is more specific to their area. And I think it's a shame that we can't really have the time right now to do the small area planning, because I think that's what a lot of people want to inform the land use plan. But I do think it would be helpful if you could at least be able to provide that type of information to the various neighborhoods and see what type of feedback you get. Because I think in those residential areas, especially, they're going to want to look at things with a finer grain. I've also been hearing from a lot of people in my neighborhood, and just got an email with a question about, I think some people are excited that some of the residential density will increase. And sorry, I just realized I didn't have my video on. Hi, everybody. But people are wondering, what does that mean for their tax assessment on their property? They may not necessarily be interested in taking advantage of a higher zoning at any time in the near future, but are they going to have are they going to be slapped with a major tax bill as soon as the zoning changes? So I think there should be some conversations around that, because that could create some real issues. And the dog is squeezing under the table. But yeah, I think those are my main comments for the moment until we dig in a little bit more.
Okay. Thanks, Ashley. I'll note we do have an appendix to the presentation. This one, and I think the webinar presentations, does have the map broken up into quadrants, but recognizing I'm not sure, if that's quite the scale people need, but happy to try to find ways to get the plan into people's hands in a way that works to review it. So we can look at ways to do that further. I did have a question about your small area plan comment, just briefly. I just wanted to know, was that more in reference to if we provide the map in quadrants or other smaller ways to look at it, that may make it more easy for neighborhoods to comment in general? I wasn't sure if that was tied to the small area plan comment you made or not.
I think that would help. I don't necessarily consider that a small area planning effort, but I do think that neighborhoods really want to get into it in a more detailed level right now. I would see small area plans as a totally different, kind of more detailed, multi-layered effort in the various parts of the city that would probably be informing whatever we're doing 5 years down the road from now.
Okay, I mean, I just wanted to make sure I understood your comment. I agree. That's certainly not a small area plan. So,
right.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. I think Lyle, let's have you give your comments, and then maybe we'll move on to the land use map piece.
Just briefly, the way I think the Planning Commission is thinking about the future land use map, which may be different than anyone else, is it's the outer envelope of what is possible. It isn't destiny. It isn't what the city is forcing on people. It's just the maximum we're imagining. And I think people see that maximum and think, oh no, it's going to be the maximum everywhere. That is not the case. I hope that helps some. Thank you.
That is how we're thinking about it as well. All right, well, that being said, again, just to reiterate before we move off the chapters, if anyone has more specific comments that you want to share, feel free to send those to me. We're happy to take your comments after the meeting as well. But for now, I will pass things off to Ron, who will talk through the future land use map.
Thank you, Jenny. So before we delve into the details of the draft future land use map, I think an important place to start is just going over a bit. We touched on this a few slides ago, a bit about what a future land use map is versus a zoning map. The future land use map is a critical component of the comprehensive plan. It sets the stage for the city's long-term vision of how it's going to grow. In this case, thinking 20 years ahead, defining the location and character of development in different areas of the city. You can think of this as the 10,000-foot view of the city and defining where there are opportunities for growth and density increases and other necessities related to development that will enable the city to thrive into the future. It's simply a guide for development. It can be used for evaluating development proposals. But unlike zoning, zoning has specific regulatory requirements that are related to development within each of the zoning districts. So as we think about the future land use map, it's much more broad. The zoning code is much more detailed because it is getting into more of the specifics of what it means to fulfill the future land use map. Here's an example. This is actually the city of Charlottesville current future land use map, which you can see on the left. It includes 5 different categories of development. And then on the right, you can see the city's zoning code. There's similarities in general, but you can see on the zoning map, there's much more detail. There's over 30 zoning districts within the city, and then additional 10 or so overlay districts that go along with those zoning districts. So again, I just make the point here that, you know, as we look to the future land use plan, we do have ranges, we do have approximations, we do have very broad general goals that are established in that future land use map. And it does help inform the zoning, but the zoning gets into a lot more specifics about how that overall broad goal is translated to development on the ground. So I think that's something that's worth noting before we get into the detail of the draft future land use map. This process is not one that's new this year. Back in 2017, 2018, the previous planning commission began several exercises to conceive what an update to the future land use map could mean for the city. They've started with several framework diagrams, and framework diagrams meaning ways that we can organize and think about the structure of the city. This diagram here begins to show how there's different activity centers or nodes. You'll hear that term node come up several times in the presentation. You can think of a node as an activity center. For example, one of the city's most recognizable nodes is downtown. It's a place of employment, shopping, a place where people live. It's the core of the city. It's home to many of the city's amenities. So downtown is a central node for the city. And then you can think of neighborhood scale nodes being places like downtown Belmont, the Preston Avenue area, West Main Street, Cherry Avenue. These are areas that are not as intense as downtown, but they serve as identifiable places for a number of areas within the community. So you can see here, this is fairly diagrammatic, but it begins to lay a framework of how you can get around the city, get around to these different places within the city via biking, driving, transit, and how the city is really not these standalone neighborhoods and sub-districts. It's really a system of places, and really begins to inform how we should be thinking about the city. Where are these centers of gravity? Where are there lack of centers of gravity, those activity centers, places where you can grab a gallon of milk or grab a cup of coffee or have small employment areas throughout the city. So this was an important starting point for the way that we think about the map today, the way that the Planning Commission was thinking about the map at that time. And that's an important place to start as we think about the future land use map. From there were several iterations of the map. So you could see it went from this more broad diagram, conceptual idea, to starting to provide some definition on the ground of where areas of activity could be. So you could see the darker colors are the more intense development areas, the deep purples, down to the lighter shades of yellow, which would be residential neighborhoods. And one thing to note, they were not conceiving that these residential neighborhoods remain R1. And there was the idea that there would be densification throughout the city and not just only focused in the areas shown in the darker purple and oranges. From there, we analyzed that material. We also performed our own existing conditions analysis, looking at employment hubs of the city, where amenities such as schools, recreational amenities are also located within the city. And we also began to digest what we were hearing from the public, what we were hearing from all the community engagement that had taken place to date, etc. So from there, we've developed these 9 key planning objectives, and that further helps inform how we think about the future land use map. and I'll just go through these quickly. One, we want to build upon the land use recommendations integrated in other citywide plans. We know that there are a number of small area plans. In fact, Cherry Avenue, the Cherry neighborhood had just finished up its neighborhood plan this year. So making sure that we incorporate recommendations from studies such as the Cherry Avenue, the Cherry neighborhood plan, the Streets That Work plan, and other plans that begin to inform how we think about land use and transportation and transit in the city, which all these elements work together as part of the greater city system. Ensuring that equity is a part of our process and the way we think, making sure that we provide opportunities for density increases throughout the city. That's something that was very important. Thinking about where we can increase density in the community in areas that have shopping, employment opportunities, transit, and other critical community amenities that make them great places for people to live. Exploring the development potential of vacant and underutilized properties. Think corridors such as the Emmett Street corridor, US 29 corridor, where we have fairly sprawling commercial development. Thinking long-term as how sites such as that can begin to evolve and transition and provide more opportunity for employment, housing, and economic development. Again, I touched on point 5, providing access to public open spaces and schools. These public open spaces and schools create important foundations to neighborhoods, and they're places where people want to live. So recognizing that as an opportunity, not only thinking about the city's land uses, but how it relates to UVA and what we call the urban ring. The urban ring is the area in the county that immediately surrounds the city. So not only thinking about the city itself, but how it relates to its edges is fairly important. I touched on transit. We want to make sure that we provide opportunities close to transit so everyone don't have to drive to get around, that they can walk, bike, and use the city's robust transit network. Something that we've heard many times is the need to protect, preserve, and enhance the city's natural and cultural resources. The city has a lot of natural and cultural resources, from its rivers, streams, topography, tree canopy, and of course its cultural resources. The city has a very storied history. It has a lot of cultural, historical resources, and we want to recognize that in the overall framework of the future land use map. And then thinking about the long-term economic sustainability of the city. You know, what does the city need to thrive? It needs places for employment, it needs places for innovation, and also need places for people to live. So we're thinking holistically about the overall system of the city and how all these different areas work together to make sure that we're building a successful city into the future.
Ron. One thing I wanted to hit on before we move into the framework is to note that, related to, sorry, you can go on to the next one. Related to thinking about, equitable distribution of different, densities throughout the city. We should look at the zoning map, we looked at the current land use map, but this is the map of actual current housing types on the ground. As they are today. And as you can see, some neighborhoods have more diversity of different housing types than others. And this helps to provide more options for folks in those neighborhoods. You can see there's the red are duplex, for example. Some of the orange is single family attached. You can see there are areas of the city where these pop out more. And so part of what we're trying to support with the future land use map is to look at ways to bring more of these different types throughout the different neighborhoods. I also want to note some of the considerations around equity. And equity has been a word that comes out a lot in this process, along with affordability. It's sort of two of the cornerstones of what we've been talking about. And so before we get into the map, I want to note that some of the things we've been thinking about, and we've talked with you about these previously, I think, but just to reiterate. So we're trying to balance sort of several different considerations here. One is providing more housing opportunities, including, opportunities at different levels of affordability, providing those opportunities close to people, places that people want to be, parks, schools, transit, etc. We're also looking to support community wealth building through potential land uses and eventual zoning that can support small scale housing options that would be relevant, that would provide potential homeownership opportunities. And the land use map is only one piece of that puzzle, but there are other supporting initiatives described in the chapters that can support those homeownership opportunities. And the other thing I would note is that, which sort of touched on the previous slide, was that we're really looking to increase the availability of housing in these neighborhoods that are have sort of had what we call sort of more exclusionary zoning that's really limited to single family uses, for example, to expand the range of housing types, providing some of those two or three unit options, additional ADUs, home ownership and rental opportunities throughout the city. But at the same time, we do not want to increase pressures on neighborhoods that may be at risk for displacement, including lower income neighborhoods, neighborhoods where people have been displaced previously. And so this, again, is not something that the land use map on its own can fully support. It requires supporting policies, initiatives, and we've taken a lot of that out of the affordable housing plan and put it into the chapters of the comprehensive plan to begin that work. But just to reiterate, as we've been telling to everyone that we're talking with, equity cannot be achieved in the land use plan itself. It has to be supported by other funding and initiatives in the city.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. So many of you may remember the future land use map framework, and building upon what was done in 2017, 2018, and taking a fresh look at things to understand what could be a guiding framework of how we began to look at the organization of the city. So we came up with the concept of establishing nodes, mixed use meaning opportunities for housing, retail, other commercial activities, and also employment opportunities throughout different areas of the city. So you can see there are purple bubbles shown throughout the map, and those will be representative of those mixed use nodes. And then thinking about corridors or the in-between places that begin to connect these different districts or nodes throughout the city. So you can see here, we're beginning to think about some of the major corridors that create these dynamic places that connect these different nodal areas throughout the city. And then thinking about residential development, which becomes an important fabric that the nodes and the corridors lie upon. To begin to think about or at least establish a way that we think about the city. And this map is from February and early March of 2021. As we move through the process, you can see the map on the right is much more detailed. We got feedback on other areas of the city that we might have been overlooking in the first map. So again, this begins to demonstrate how we do have open ears and want to get feedback and help refine the way that this framework develops. And this framework is very important to how we began to draft the first iteration of the future land use map, which is shown here. And many of you may be familiar with this. This was the March draft of the map. You could see moving from these general bubbles and lines down to actual future land use categories. And this was the first cut that we shared as a draft. And you can see we established a series of development land use categories, which you could see on the left, as an important starting point to gauge how we were beginning to move from the bubble diagram into an actual conceptual future land use map. From March, we further refined the future land use map. And again, this map is not absolute. It is not the final iteration. We are as Jenny had mentioned, in the midst of a community engagement effort to evaluate the recommendations of this map, get feedback on it. There will be a refinement of the map and it will change, and we're going to incorporate the feedback that we're hearing. So this is an opportunity for that discussion. So you can see on the left, we have 9 general development land use categories, which range from intensity from the downtown core down to general residential. And you can see the land uses are distributed throughout the city's boundaries based upon where we thought there were opportunities to apply those future land use categories. And we'll walk through each of those in this part of the presentation. So first, I think many of you are interested in the residential component. We have 3 residential land use categories ranging from general residential. We see these areas supporting a range of soft density housing types, from duplexes to triplexes, single family splits. If you have a single family home and you want to split into multiple units, take advantage of topography with basement walkout units, etc. But thinking about the range of housing from 1 to 3 units per lot in the general residential category. And as we walk through the presentation, you will hear a lot of ranges. Again, thinking back to that slide that compared the future land use map with the zoning. Now we're conceptually thinking of ranges. So you are going to have ranges. It's not absolute, but it will help guide the way we think about the zoning map in the next phase of work. So I did want to point that out with the ranges. Next up, we have the medium intensity residential category, which you can see in the darker golden color throughout various areas of the city. That would be a step up from general residential. Unit types would range from 4 to upwards at the high end, 12 units per lot, to support a variety of housing types, including row houses, townhouses, single family splits. Perhaps larger homes could be split into multiple units with ADUs. Something I didn't mention in the general residential category, and opportunities to support more density in existing neighborhoods, is the adoption of ADUs, which I have a couple of precedent images of these different housing types on the next slide that we can walk through. So it gives a little bit more opportunity for higher density within that medium intensity category. And then at the highest end of the spectrum, we have high intensity residential, which you can see in the dark brown. These areas would support apartment development. Think about the mix of housing types along 14th Street. There's a number of multifamily developments, some larger, some smaller, but these residential types could range from 13 units and beyond in the high intensity residential category. So just to delve into a little bit more detail about these categories, you can see here that housing can lie on a spectrum. The image at the left, this is an image from Richmond actually that shows that accessory dwelling unit. So your general residential category that has 1 to 3 units, you can have a primary home in the front with a carriage house, which is a historical lot configuration that many of you may be familiar with in Charlottesville, something that's very prevalent. But you can see in this example, you have a smaller accessory dwelling unit in the back, and then a primary home in the front. Duplexes, triplexes would all lie within the spectrum of general residential. As far as the urban form across all of these different residential categories, we want to make sure that we're compatible with existing residential and historic neighborhood context. We touched on this a bit earlier in the presentation with some of the discussion around the diversity of the city. There are areas of the city that have historic overlays, historic districts, historic properties. So we want to make sure that the form can relate to those different districts and the different characters of the city, while also allowing for increased density that will in turn allow for more diverse housing types throughout the city. I think an important component to density is thinking about height. Here on the slides, you can see the range of heights for all 3 different residential categories, with the general residential category keeping in scale to that 2.5 story housing type that can be found all over Charlottesville, up to 3.5 stories where appropriate. Again, all of these future land use categories will need to be sensitive to the unique conditions within each neighborhood. So think about that future land use map and the zoning map. The future land use map will need to be broken down into sub-districts so that we can begin to understand how these different intensities of height can be applied across the board and cater to the individual neighborhoods within the city. Moving on to medium intensity residential townhomes, 4+ units. I have on the next slide, I have a couple of examples of those housing types, and then the highest intensity residential, which will be up to 15 stories. Again, I mean, not 15 stories, sorry, up to 13 units per lot and up to 5 stories. And here's an example. This is the 14th Street corridor right in Charlottesville. You can see this is one of the high intensity residential areas that can support a mix of different housing types and intensity of development.
Hey, Ron, before you move off of that, I just wanted to ask, would you like to take questions at each of these?
Sure, I think that would be good. And that way we don't get too far along.
Okay,
but before we do that, can I just show the medium intensity examples? Because I think this goes hand in hand with the previous slides. We got a lot of questions about what medium intensity could look like and how it can fit into a fabric, particularly of an existing neighborhood. Here are a couple of examples of fourplexes. You can see they can be integrated into the fabric of a neighborhood. They don't have to be 5 stories to get fourplexes or any of the medium intensity development types. You can see these are 2-story developments with pitched roofs, very similar to the architectural style of Charlottesville. And then, of course, multiplexes moving up the chain. Of course, these are much larger buildings, but you can see they can be articulated in a way that if you were to drive by this residential development, you wouldn't even know it's a 5-plex. It looks like a large mansion, for example, but there are ways to increase density and have it fit within the character of the neighborhood. No, we cannot drive the architectural style of what these buildings look like, but we can drive the form, and we can do that through zoning. So that's something that we wanted to just show some examples of, because we had a lot of questions about the medium intensity residential category, particularly this weekend we were out on site.
Thanks, Ron. Ashley, would you like to give your comment or question?
Yes, I like that the land use map is starting to break up the giant swaths of single family and give more opportunities for other housing types. But I wonder if we should really, and you're probably going to get more into this, Ron, but it seems to me the strategy for adding units in the city and adding residential is maybe we need to talk about the hierarchy of how that can truly happen in Charlottesville. And that's a little bit what we were getting into earlier, and thinking about what exactly is the strategy. And I would see that more kind of getting out of the way in some of our mixed use corridors and really allowing more density, more height in those areas, looking at nodes, like you said, and also there's some pretty key potential redevelopment sites in the city, some of these larger land masses that we know will redevelop in the future. And so that's where I see the major places to add residential. I certainly want to promote missing middle and other housing types, but I think that might be what's driving a lot of fear in the community right now, is that all of a sudden all these existing neighborhoods are going to be disrupted and changed. And so I think as you're in your approach, you may want to just be thinking about that and knowing that the reality is most of the residential density is going to go in the places that aren't actually included in these purely residential categories, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes sense. And thinking about how the city will change incrementally over time, it's not going to happen overnight. And I like your points about, those underutilized lands, somewhat prioritizing those areas first, because they're kind of the low hanging fruit areas where we can get a lot of density and impact within a few sites, because they're larger, they can support more of the nodes, and they really become catalytic for the development of many of those districts. So I really like your thoughts on thinking about that approach. And we need to spell that out more in how we think about the city evolving into the future, because I think that's an important piece of the discussion.
Yes, that'll be a huge part of your implementation is where do you kind of drive that density so it's not disrupting all of the city.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. And Ron. Diane, would you like to give your comments?
Yeah, Ron, could you go back to the slide that just shows the plan of the residential, the land use plan for residential? Yeah. I'm speaking as a member of the steering committee as well as an active board member for my neighborhood, and I've been participating in a lot of Zooms in the last couple of weeks on as our neighborhood gets invited to participate with other neighborhoods, because as you know, there is a lot of concern about this map. First of all, as a neighborhood, we have a lot of diversity in our neighborhood in terms of property owners and sizes of houses and everything. And the entire board is totally in agreement with the strategy of eliminating R1 across the city and moving to this, as you call it, the soft density approach, where you're allowing for flexibility and infill. And that's a R1 has been exclusionary, and it's been part of the problem, and we welcome that. The board in general and myself are concerned, however, as I've already said to you in off conversations, but I'd like the other members of the steering committee to hear this as well, is that we're concerned about how the goals and principles have manifested on the plan, and in particular, the medium density residential. As it's drawn, and I realize Lee just sent in a chat that there would be hierarchy of zoning types, and that's good to hear, and that may address some of our concerns. But when you look at this map, it's clear that certain areas have been selected to carry the higher, the medium, in particular, densities. And it's when people look at this map, there isn't any narrative about why this area is selected. Why is Rugby Road lined with higher medium density? Why is Locust Grove, et cetera? So it's not a clear, other than the statement that you've determined that the densities would be placed in areas that had more traditional exclusionary zoning, but there's not a clear narrative of. So when people look at the plan, and as I stood at the pop-up over the weekend and observed, why are you doing this to my neighborhood? It looks like an imposition of density that is very disruptive, and it's true this will happen over time, but it feels like an imposition on that neighborhood. What we've talked about is that we like the ideas of the general residential and the soft density. Is there an opportunity to merge the ambitions of transforming Charlottesville to general residential, which is a big step to begin with, and to merge some of the intentions of the medium density? And I recognize this may happen as you move towards a more strata, that there's more levels of medium density. But to look at it as a more citywide solution. Right now, it looks, again, imposed on particular areas, but to embrace the soft density and the infill citywide, so that these changes can happen in a more integrated and balanced way, and that they blend in with the neighborhood rather than change the neighborhood. I remember listening to the end of your presentation to the Planning Commission. The land use diagram was shown in February, I think in January, February, whenever that was. And one of the commissioners said, somewhat rhetorically at the end of the presentation, well, the big question is, how are we going to decide who has to change? And this map looks like, well, here we've decided who has to change. And that's how neighborhoods are receiving it. Where I think that if it's a more citywide, more integrated, and it's a chance to make these changes and again, integrate them, blend them into the existing neighborhood fabric so that it's not a plan that's looking at change in a big way, but it's welcoming in the density and the different types of housing in ways that can be received and again, I'm repeating my words, but blended in. And so I think that I appreciate that the team is focusing on the need for further study and further delineation and hierarchy, but the lines right now are they're delineated in a hard way, and it's very, very as I talked to you over the weekend, Ron, that under the worst case scenarios, this could end up with total redevelopment of a block in higher densities. That may not happen, but a worst case scenario could happen, and that's what's talking to the fears of the community. And I think that the next iteration of this plan really needs to address that and help. There should be a narrative, which I haven't found any written word, why this area is, why Lewis Mountain Road is now almost entirely medium intensity. I think that's not my neighborhood, but as I understand it, that neighborhood is having a hard time understanding why their entire neighborhood is designated in this way. So I think that it's a very big issue to address.
Thanks, Diane. I agree with you. I think in conversations we've been having, we've been talking through some, rationale specific to neighborhoods, but you're right that we need to put something, I think, more on paper to allow folks to have access to that. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good comment.
Let's see, we have 3 more hands up. Lena, would you like to say your comments?
Sure. So my comments are about this slide and the other one. So actually, I think that the other one is a little easier and I would start there. Yes, that one. Thank you. So I'm wondering about the general residential. So I guess before I get into sort of the specifics of my comments, I should just say, I live in Belmont. I'm interested in having a little more diversity in my neighborhood. I know that, we have a high amount of home ownership. And so I don't think that, allowing some additional density, I don't have the fear that like everything is going to change all at once. I welcome having more diversity in my neighborhood. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. And so I'm wondering one kind of little detail on this where it says, in the general residential, it only says 3 units, whereas, at an average of 2 stories, there are plenty of little houses that are split into 4. At 2 stories, it's 4 apartments. They're easier to build. They mirror each other. They have the same footprint. I'm wondering why it's only 3 units there, because it seems like 4 units could very nicely fit into a 2-story building that fits into the neighborhood. So I feel like that number there is a little low and that it could be higher, 4 or even 5, 4 with a 5th little apartment on top potentially. So I'd like to talk more about that. I
think Lee may want to respond to that now if you'd like, or
that'd be fine.
I saw you come off mute, Lee. I hope I didn't call you.
No, I did just want to say that while we were working on strategic housing plan component, the affordable housing plan component, we did have a conversation about the difference in impact between 3 and 4. You may have followed the exercise in Minneapolis in which they began talking about 4 and ended adopting 3. Part of the conversation was about the likelihood that the existing house would be replaced as opposed to split. So the 3 is most likely, an additional building on the property and potentially a unit carved out of the main house. The 4, as you say, provides opportunities to build a 4-plex, and to build an efficient 4-plex, you're going to take down the existing house. And I think there is some rightful concern about that happening across vast areas of the community. So we did back off and select the 3. But in the end, these are political choices to make. And so that's just where that came from.
I know here in Belmont, at least, there's still a lot of unbuilt lots where a 4-plex would make total sense. We're still getting a lot of infill, of lots that were bought, to go with a house and then get sold separately from the house. And so I think there's opportunity for 4-plexes in those places.
Thanks. I think that's something to consider. Thanks for mentioning that. I didn't want to cut you off if you have additional comments you wanted to share, Lena.
No, that's quite all right. Thank you. That was probably much better. I appreciate it. So the other comment was, if you could go back to the slide with the layout of the neighborhoods. Yeah, thanks. So we talked about this at the pop-up about Belmont not showing much density. In fact, I was there with a friend of mine who works for Habitat for Humanity, and some of the medium intensity residential in the Belmont area are places where there's already existing, I don't know, through SUPs or other formats, where there's already existing higher density. So I'm not sure that we would be opening up a lot of opportunities. Earlier maps had some more of the medium intensity residential. There are 3 bus routes that come through the Belmont neighborhood. It has a walkable grid. It's close to downtown. One of those bus routes goes down to the Wegmans shopping center, where we have a grocery store, and we have all kinds of shopping opportunities. So I was pretty surprised that there wasn't more medium intensity residential, say along Elliott Cherry in Belmont, or some of these other, or Monticello or Avon. I'm a little surprised. That seems like a good place to add some density.
And one of the factors that we looked at specifically with Belmont is the size of lots. Belmont has some of the smallest, narrowest concentration of lots in the city. And that 3-unit category seems on the low end, but considering the lot sizes and the risk of demolition, it seemed like 3 units per lot was an intense or high density consideration or density category for the consideration of lot size that exists on the ground today. But we did hear, I think I heard from other people as well, looking at that Belmont area for more opportunities for intensity beyond the 3 units per lot, even though there are more smaller lots in that district. But thinking that there could be some further density support. We heard a lot about the Monticello Avenue North area. We did hear some comments on Elliott Avenue as another area that could support higher density. So that's something that we definitely took note of and we'll be looking at as well.
Yeah. I mean, I also think and I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this particular area has a high level of home ownership or decent one. And that, that I can see how in a neighborhood where there's a lot of rentals where, there would be a stronger fear of places being torn down to rebuild. But I think this is one area that has a pretty high level of home ownership, which I think would kind of offset that somewhat. And also that these are things from my email that we talked about at the pop-up. I'm just trying to reiterate to get feedback from the larger group in part. But also I think that like the lower part of, or there's the downtown Belmont, but sort of the lower part of Belmont tends to be a little more towards mid or low income housing. And my understanding is that when you increasing density will not on its own afford affordable housing, that intensity in a low income neighborhood is more likely to afford low income housing, whereas intensity in a high income neighborhood is not likely to give you a lot of affordable housing. So it seems like Belmont would be a great area if the goal is affordable housing, to add some in that neighborhood that has a lot of home ownership and sort of a middle to low income housing. It's on paper, it seems like it would be a great place for that. So
thanks, Lena. I think, as Ron mentioned, we've heard that from others as well. So that's something we'll be thinking about as we move forward. I know we've got 2 more hands raised on this, and then we'll move on. But I want to make sure we give time to hear from them. So Jody, would you like to give your comments?
Sure. Ron, could you go to the next slide, please? So my comment is about the second line item, form. I think a lot of the concern about the number of units can be taken care of if the forms are, as stated here, compatible and contextual to the neighborhood. Neighborhoods, lots change an awful lot. I presume that the definitions for how to decide whether or not the forms are compatible is written into the zoning code. Do you feel confident that that can be done well? And am I correct in that this would have to be better defined with the parameters for how to judge whether or not something proposed fits within the context of the neighborhood?
That's right. And I think for us in this forum discussion, setting the stage for how we think about zoning with the maximum heights, number of stories. Again, for example, medium intensity residential, 4.5 stories would not certainly be appropriate in many instances when it's located in an existing single family neighborhood. So that form description really informs how we think about the breakdown of taking this mass designation of residential districts and breaking them down into sub-districts based upon the existing residential character, height, housing types, topography. We've heard a lot about topography as a challenge, and it is a challenge in Charlottesville. Charlottesville has a lot of topographical challenges. So thinking about topography and other areas of concern related to form will be important.
Even lot size.
Even lot size, thinking about Belmont versus some of the other areas in the city that have larger lots, for example, and what that looks like as far as density and what you can actually physically put or place on a lot.
There's a lot of considerations and a lot of parameters that define whether or not something is compatible and contextual to the particular lot that it's on. And so here, to me, the devil's in these details in ordinance, getting this right.
That's right. We really
Thank you.
have to craft that approach.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. Welcome.
And then the final question that we'll take on this is from Valerie Washington, who is joining us as a new member on the steering committee representing CLIC. So welcome, Valerie, and you're welcome to come off mute and share your comment.
Hi, thank you. So my first question / concern is in terms of the equitable community engagement. I'm just curious to hear about like what you guys have been doing in terms of equitable community engagement.
Sure, Latoya, would you like to speak to that? Latoya Thomas is on our team leading the community engagement aspect for this project, so she may want to chime in on that.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, thank you for the question. So throughout the process, we've tried to use a number of different methods to engage with residents across the city. One thing I'll highlight is that when we first started the process around engagement, our initial plan was before COVID hit. And so our initial plan was actually obviously be out in person a bit more, be able to do more on site in Charlottesville type engagement activities. And so we adapted our approach given COVID, given the limitations on being able to socially connect with folks in person. So when we launched the engagement effort, we moved a lot of our engagement virtual. In addition to having the virtual engagement that was for the public that we knew could access technology, we also tried to work with various organizations throughout the city to bring residents on either by phone or by internet to provide feedback. So we've worked with a number of organizations to try to get homeowners from all across the city, renters from across the city, low-income residents, members of the refugee community, getting those folks, as well as stakeholders from particular segments of the population, such as the real estate development community, getting those folks as part of the conversation as well. In addition to our virtual outreach, which includes our website, which includes our toll-free number that's still maintained, and also social media, we've had a number of print materials available throughout the process. So when we ran the community-wide survey, we had hard copy distribution in addition to electronic distribution. We've had door hangers go out at various stages of the engagement process. We've had yard signs go out at various stages of the engagement process. And then most recently, which is in the last 2 weeks, because the world is now starting to reopen a bit, we've been able to actually implement some of our in-person pop-up opportunities. So we had a few of those over the last 2 weekends, and we're looking to figure out some other ways through this particular phase of engagement that we're in to get more information out to folks and get feedback from a variety of different means.
Thank you. In terms of the locations of your pop-up shops, how were those determined?
Sure. So we tried to, at least for this initial round of pop-ups, we tried to select a couple of locations that were where we felt we could get a mix of people from the city. So we chose a number of, we chose a grocery store. So we did Reed Supermarket. We did the farmer's market at X Park. We did a church in the north as a way to, in particular, to target the Spanish-speaking community. We did Riverview Park, the downtown mall. So probably 1 or 2 other locations that I'm not remembering as well, but we tried to pick a mix of locations where we knew we would be able to get a variety of people from across the city, either because folks were going there to recreate or folks were going there to shop, to buy groceries.
Gotcha. So I just have a concern that while this process has been going on for a while now, there's still many folks in the community that I've spoken to who have no idea about this process. And not only do they not know about the process, they don't understand it. Is there any plan to really put some education out there for folks who are having difficulty understanding the planning process so they can better participate? And is there, like, moving forward, there's just way too many, especially people of color, Black folks,
Mhm.
and historically Black communities that just have no idea what's going on, and that's troubling to me. Even looking at this call and the steering, like I know this is a steering committee call. All the faces, most of the faces look the same. This is a very white call, and I think that's an issue. As we talk about, I know we've talked about, you've talked about equity and in ways to, what's important to me is preserving Black neighborhoods where Black folks are being displaced. I only see a few people of color on this call, and I find that to be troubling. As we talk about things changing in the city and developing, I don't see voices that we need to hear a part of this call.
So in terms of just being able to share information around the education of the process, absolutely. So a big part of our effort as we've gone through this entire process is not assuming that everyone understands what the planning process is. And so we'll continue, as we talk to folks, we're always trying to start from square one with the assumption that not everyone knows where the process started, as well as just the fact that not everyone knows what's happening around planning and around this discussion. So that's bare minimum. That's number one. Number two, one of the things we've continued to reiterate throughout this process, and particularly with the steering committee, and particularly with all of the many other people who are tied to this process, is that the engagement process is also only as good as the networks in the city that we can also work to leverage. And so we are reaching out to as many people that we can obviously get connected to, but we also know that many of you are connected to folks. And so we will continue to make ourselves available. If there are groups of folks that you want to convene, we are happy to work with you to convene those folks for conversation, while we also continue to do direct outreach, whether that direct outreach is door knocking or putting out door hangers or flyers. So we know that all of you have networks. And so we want to continue to work through the networks that you all have to make sure that we can answer as many questions as folks have and make sure that folks really understand this process, particularly folks who may not typically be part of the public process.
Valerie, I think we could certainly have a follow-up conversation with you as well to talk more, if there's specific aspects of this process you think we need to be emphasizing more or whatnot, or clarifying. I think we can certainly work to do that.
Thank you. I know the word, as has been stated earlier, equity has been thrown around a lot, and I'm not really seeing that here yet. So that's one of my main concerns. I also had a question about, and I'm not fully up to date with the new plan, but there was a highlight of cultural resources, and I would like to know, what cultural resources do you guys plan on really highlighting? Because I don't see a lot of Black cultural resources being highlighted in this particular plan.
So I think in the chapter called Land Use, Urban Form, and Historic and Cultural Preservation, that's where we put in strategies about, and I don't have it in front of, I don't have it open right now to give verbatim what they say, but I think it focuses on preserving, working with communities to ensure that places are important to neighborhoods, or just, to specific communities, that they are sort of celebrated and retained and sort of elevated. And so within the land use framework, we're not necessarily pointing out what those locations are, but I think the land use plan, the land use chapter would support including that in additional processes that happen at the smaller scale at sort of the neighborhood level.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. Let's see, Ron, let's keep going through the slides. I'm gonna suggest that you walk through the rest of the mixed use nodes and mixed use corridors, and then we can pause for discussion on that. I want to note, I know it's already 7:08. We're gonna keep going. If you need to hop off the call, just send me an email. Let me know where you left off. We'd be happy to find time to meet with you to talk through the other materials. And for those of you who are in the audience attending, if you'd like to stay on, I'm sure we'll be going past a bit 7:30. I'm committed to staying on and recording comments for at least 15 minutes or so. If you need to hop off before we're done and you want to send an email to engage@cvilleplans-together.com directed at the steering committee, I'm happy to make sure that they get it. With that being said, Ron, go ahead.
Thank you. So the next category of land use that we're going to discuss is the mixed use nodes. Think of these areas as we discussed earlier in the 2017-2018 concept of creating these places of gravity, these center places within existing neighborhoods where you can have a mix of housing types, a mix of commercial activity, providing opportunities for living and working and recreating and play, and really create these centerpieces of the community within these nodes. So we have three different types. We have downtown, which many of you are aware of. It's the central hub of the city. We have designated that as its own district. Then we have urban mixed use nodes, which you can see in the dark purple area. Areas east, west, and south of downtown. Many of these areas are absorbed in the strategic investment area zone, which was a master plan that was done and completed for the city for the south of downtown area. And then also another major urban mixed use node would be the Emmett Street US 29 corridor. As we shown here, lots of underutilized vibrant commercial areas, but those are, as we discussed earlier, some really good opportunities to create place, create a dynamic mixed-use district beyond just single-story commercial districts. We have an opportunity to transform those areas into vibrant mixed-use districts that can support housing and other economic development goals. And then we have our neighborhood mixed use nodes. These are places where, again, we can have a place where you can buy a gallon of milk, visit a cafe, have community resources located close to the neighborhoods in which they can serve. So you can see those areas highlighted in the pink, and they are placed through various areas of the city for those neighborhood mixed use nodes. Let's go into a little bit of detail about what those mixed use nodes could be. Overall, all three different nodal types can again support commercial employment and residential uses, encouraging vertical mixed use. And that's when you have commercial activated uses on the ground floor and then residential uses on the upper floors to create that mix of use. The form, again, very similarly to the residential category, making sure that we conform to or respond to existing residential, environmental, and historic contexts to create new and complete places that have walkable streets, civic amenities, and an intensive mix of land uses. All these areas can encompass places of historic and cultural value. Downtown, as we know, as one district that has a high concentration of historical resources. So that's something that should be reflected in how that district evolves over time, and making sure that we respond to that historical and cultural fabric that already exists downtown. Height, we have a range of heights for each district. Again, mixed use nodes up to 4 stories. Again, these are ranges. It could be 2 stories, it could be 3 stories, it could be 4 stories, upwards to 5 stories. We think 5 stories is on the high end, but there could be some places that's appropriate to that, particularly on internal locations within the site that can absorb additional heights and not be overshadowing to existing adjacent neighborhood districts. Mixed use urban nodes, 5 to 8 stories, again, going a little bit higher with the intensity of development within these districts. On the high end, 10 stories, again, where the maximum stories are appropriate to the existing historic fabric. You certainly don't want to put a 10-story building next to a 2-story residential house, but making sure that we're contextual and allowing those additional heights where it meets comprehensive goals, particularly those goals related to housing affordability and wealth building. And then last but not least, downtown, a little bit lower density or height, 2 to 6 stories primarily. You can see in the picture, this is a snippet of downtown. You see there's a wide range of building heights within downtown. Some buildings do reach as tall as 10 stories. Again, accommodating the wide range of building types, building heights within that district that blend in with the existing fabric of that district. Here are a couple examples of nodes. We have corridors. We also have nodes. The primary difference between the two is that nodes are typically larger parcel areas. So you have an opportunity to create a complete node, if you will, that can support kind of a wide range of civic amenities such as parks and open spaces, streets, thinking about how some of these larger areas are subdivided into walkable, bikeable development areas, and how that development character relates to the overall experience, the pedestrian and experience within these places. So you can see a couple of examples of how a mixed use district could evolve at different scales. Moving on to the corridors. These are the different mixed use corridors that we've identified as opportunities within the city. Again, neighborhood mixed use corridors, the lower end of the intensity scale, such that they are immediately relatable to the existing residential fabric in which they lie. Urban mixed use corridors, areas where you can have more intensive mixed use development. Think of areas such as West Main Street, Preston Avenue corridor, particularly Grady to McIntyre Road, those types of major corridors that are already receiving higher intensity development. And then also business and technology, hearkening back to the goal of economic development and economic prosperity, having distinct zones and districts within the city that can continue to evolve to include production, light industrial mixed uses, as well as technology and other key economically sustainable business opportunities. Here are a couple of examples of the 3 different districts. Again, you can see from the imagery, neighborhood mixed use corridors promoting a low scale, vibrant pedestrian scaled corridor mixed use environment that has an active ground floor use that can also accommodate other uses such as residential and office uses above. And this is an example. You can see buildings may include a variety of heights ranging anywhere to 3 to 5 stories, 5 stories being on the upper end, again, making sure that we're contextual to adjacent uses. Urban mixed use corridors, think of places like West Main Street. This is an example of a development along West Main Street. And we know through many of the projects on West Main Street that context is very important in how these developments relate to adjacent neighborhoods, particularly because West Main Street is on a ridge and there are many residential neighborhoods that lie in the valley adjacent to the corridor. So thinking about, again, the context, topography, those environmental historic constraints are something that should be considered. What I did like about this particular building is the articulation and scale of how the building steps down to the street, such that the building doesn't loom over the streetscape environment. They also incorporated some of the existing structures as part of the overall development approach, which I thought was fairly interesting and a good example of how you can achieve infill development without wiping clean the slate of a site. And then business and technology, mixed use, again, light industrial, manufacturing, and other uses related to economic development. But it could allow for some residential uses where appropriate. The form, very similar to the residential categories, making sure that we're contextual to the existing urban fabric. Many of the business and technology mixed use districts are located at existing industrial areas of the city. So as those sites begin to turn over and new business uses develop, it provides an opportunity to reclaim and rehabilitate the land and create more vibrant uses in those districts. Heights here, again, neighborhood corridor, mixed use, averaging 3 stories up to 5 stories where appropriate. Intersections can be looked to as kind of points where you can get additional heights in some instances. Same with urban mixed use corridors, 5 to 8 stories as an average within those corridors. And then business and technology mixed use ranging up to 6 stories. Here are a couple of examples of mixed use corridors. They can range in height and intensity. I like this example on the top right because it shows how you really can step back a building such that when you're walking and you're part of the pedestrian experience, you don't have buildings looming over you. And it creates just a much more pleasant environment and an environment that's more contextual. So we touched on a lot of these development considerations throughout the presentation. Again, there are many considerations that should be taken note of as we look to refining the character of these districts and certainly moving into the next phase of work with the zoning code rewrite. But again, heights and scale is important. There are a number of historic districts within the city. We see those districts continuing into the future and that those controls defining building setbacks, step backs, heights, etc. will continue. Making sure that we're keeping the environment in mind, critical slopes, so just generally slopes in general is important. So thinking about stormwater and also the aesthetics of how these buildings fit within the topography is very important. As well as the tree canopy. We heard a lot of commentary around ensuring that Charlottesville remain a green city and that tree canopies are protected where possible, but there is robust plans around how the tree canopy can continue and evolve as sites develop throughout the city. And transportation is important, making sure that any future transportation projects or other transportation related improvements throughout the city support the recommendations of where we intend higher density to occur in the future. Quickly, we did a couple of overlays of the future land use map. This is an overlay of the county's urban ring plan districts around the periphery of the city. We overlaid our plan on top to make sure that there's continuity of land uses from the city into the county. That's something that's very important because we want to make sure that we have borders that are related. Here is the map of the 2013 future land use map and the 2021 draft update, or at least where we are in the process to date. You can see the future land use map on the left. Our map has much more detail and definition. Again, 5 land use categories, 9 development land use categories for the 2021 update. We've also started to look at the allocation of land uses within the different land use categories. We have more mixed use districts in the 2021 plan, which is good because it can support more multifamily development within those mixed use districts as well. And of course, we have a new category, which would be the medium intensity residential category, which would be a major change from the 2013 plan. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Sure, just a few quick notes, and then we'll be happy to have some more discussion. I just want to talk about some of the changes we made between March and May. We met with the Planning Commission on March 30th and discussed the map on the left, and the May draft is the one you see on the right. One of the major changes we made was some color changes for clarity to more clarify the hierarchy of things. So where you see purple on the left and dark purple on the right. We haven't switched the categories, at least not across the board. It's just a change of color. Another adjustment that we made was, more substantial adjustment, was looking at industrial areas. For example, we considered, not only we reverted to the description of business and technology instead of industrial, and that follows on the current 2013 plan. But we've also adjusted the areas shown for the business and technology, recognizing that these areas can also potentially be locations for some of this nodal development that can support not only employment uses, but also potential higher density residential uses. We also, thinking about these nodes and comments that we've received previously throughout the process about people wanting more complete communities and walkable communities, we added a few additional nodes, the pink locations throughout the city. We know this is something that has been a topic of hot discussion, I would say, that we've been hearing. And so we will be talking more about that as we move forward and refine the plan. We also looked again at the areas around UVA. You can see there is changes to some of the densities shown for the residential areas along JPA, as well as in Lewis Mountain and parts of Venable. And our reasoning for that was that UVA, as you all know, is a huge economic driver, in addition to being a huge hub for activity of students. And so we, in looking at these areas around the university, wanted to try and better display that these are sort of unique areas in the city that could potentially provide additional different housing options, not only for students, but also people who work at the university or at the hospital, to really help to build that walkable community we've been hearing people would like to see. But again, that is also something that we've been hearing a lot about. So we are continuing to gather comments on that. And then the last thing I will note is that you can see a sort of expansion of the medium intensity residential from one map to the other. And that was to further the goal of supporting more housing opportunities throughout the city, sort of looking at where are there additional sort of these medium intensities now, and where might we want to place them to really not only achieve the housing goals, but also some of the other planning objectives. So I think those are the major updates I would give. The other thing I want to note before we go into comments is just a few notes about the affordable housing plan and how these land use recommendations tie into that. As you all probably recall, there are sort of 4 sets of land use recommendations in the affordable housing plan related to multifamily housing, soft density, which is things like duplexes and triplexes and ADUs. Another land use plan specifically focused on accessory dwelling units or ADUs, and then an inclusionary zoning policy recommendation as well. And so we're showing here, and I won't go through these in detail, but we're showing here how we've worked to address these different affordable housing plan land use recommendations in the map here. But again, as I reiterated earlier, the map is only one piece of this, and the other strategies that you'll find in the housing chapter are needed to tie to really support affordability in the city. So that being said, Ron, do you want to go back to the map maybe? Or just go back a little bit? I think there was, I know Ashley had raised her hand during one of the mixed use areas. So would you like to provide your comments?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to put in a plug for building height. I'm hoping in these descriptions that I'm a little concerned when it talks about average building heights, and that's just in thinking like once we get into like if folks have to do a rezoning or special permits or anything, that it could get interpreted that every single project needs average building heights. I think there's a lot of the descriptions of these districts only allow height at certain intersections and whatnot. And I guess I just don't like the fact that Charlottesville in general has this anti-height sentiment. So I would love it if we could think of a different approach, more so knowing that, you know, all developments of a certain height, if they're near lower density residential, have to do a shadow study. They may have to step down if the shadow study, you know, reveals issues, maybe something more to that effect, but getting a little bit more flexibility on height.
Thanks, Ashley. We'll talk within the team about ways we can do that. I think that's a good recommendation. Appreciate it. Let's see, Diane, would you like to give your comment?
Oh, I hadn't hit
Okay,
raise
sorry.
my hand, but I do have a comment. I will have one
Okay.
last comment if I might.
Sure.
I had yet to hit it. I do think that one issue that just has to be said out loud, that is something that I know you're hearing, and I've heard it in every meeting I've attended, and every neighborhood group I've attended, is that the having conducted a process, a public process during a pandemic, and that now people are raising their heads, they're vaccinated, and they're coming out and realizing that there is a land use plan to discuss. And I think it's great that you as a team are making the point to make more pop-ups and Zoom meetings and offering to Zoom in with local groups. But what that doesn't mitigate is the lack of public participation through the past year. The pandemic happened, decisions were made, and particularly in the fall when things were coming out, such as the Affordable Housing Plan, which most of the community doesn't really understand how it informs the plan. It's not being addressed because it was previewed with the public last fall when everyone had their head down dealing with Zoom school and Zoom work and healthcare and everything else, and reasonably so. It was a 100-year health event. And so I think that while there's more focus and more opportunity for public input, the public didn't really participate in discussions, in the early discussions that framed the issues that led to the plan, and in the affordable housing plan. And I know you're hearing complaints about that, but I think that in the steering committee, just in terms of recommendations of how this is being addressed, it's something that I think the consultant team is going to need to make a statement about it, whether it means stepping back and providing more opportunity to discuss this at the diagrammatic stage. But there was a decision to proceed through the pandemic, and in retrospect, that may have been a mistake, because I think that Charlottesville is an activist town. People typically participate and are knowledgeable. I'm a member of your committee. I've sent out every mailing that you've sent to my neighborhood, and my neighborhood is clueless too. It's across the board. It's just a general sense of not really understanding a process that's all of a sudden hitting them. And it seems like it's, well into, I know this is a draft, but it's well into development, and people are very concerned about that.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Diane. We'll, yeah, like you said, we've certainly heard that same thing from other folks, and so we are, we're continuing to figure out the best way to make sure that people are meaningfully involved. So, we will, we will sort of, I think, be seeing in the next couple of weeks how things pan out in terms of the sort of level of engagement we've had. But we're not ruling out some additional potential engagement as well. Let's see, I think we have 2 more hands raised. Lisa, would you like to speak?
Yes. I had previously made a request that throughout all of this process, that we have a map of the previous redlining in the city, and that showing that as a comparison of where the new development will be, because there are communities that were disadvantaged by the previous redevelopment idea or supposed redevelopment. And going back to the history of Vinegar Hill and Gospel Hill, there is communities that were negatively impacted, and now we're going through redevelopment again, and we see a lack of equity in terms of participation. And I see nothing within this where it shows us where we were and how we're going to prevent that negative effect in communities of African American historical context. I don't see that, and I don't understand why we cannot have a map in comparison of where we were previously and where we are going to be now, or have that as an overlay to prevent some of the negative impacts of development in communities of color. Can you address that for me?
Yes. We, as you recall, we have talked about this, and we in our discussions with the community during this phase, and as you may recall in the last steering committee meeting, we have talked about that history. We have shown the maps, but I hear what you're saying, that you would like to see, and that's a very understandable thing. You want to see that overlaid on the map, sort of as to show how we're proposing might fall within those areas. And that is something, you're right, that we have discussed and we have not shown, and I would be happy to commit to doing that. I'm sorry it's not shown here, but it has been a part of our process as we're going through to make, to propose the draft map. We have been looking at both the previous, oh, sorry, I just realized I'm not on video, the previous redlining sort of districts that were out there. We have been looking at as well, current demographics. Where are there sort of majority Black communities, for example, in the city, as well as where there are other sort of at risk for displacement populations, such as lower wealth or lower income communities. So you're right that we need to show that on a map, and how that relates to the plan. And so I'm happy to commit to doing that, and I'm sorry we didn't provide that here.
And also, it helps to address individuals who bring up questions, why in my neighborhood, or why not in my neighborhood. If we see that visual connection, it helps to explain that narrative.
I agree. I appreciate that you have brought that up again. And again, I apologize it's not shown in this current draft.
Thank you.
Let's see, I think our final question here is Emily Dreyfus. Would you like to give your comment?
Yes, thanks. I appreciate all of the information, and I know you all have been working really hard to present it to so many different people. My concern is that this does not go far enough in terms of integrating neighborhoods that have been historically exclusive. And we all knew it would come down to this kind of debate, people who live in those neighborhoods not wanting to see change, and or at least not wanting to see significant change. And no matter what the timing was, it was going to come down to this kind of a dichotomy. I do want to point out that the data that you all have shared about prior outreach showed a lot of engagement. The missing piece, or at least the, excuse me, the not optimal piece, was engagement with Black people. And I appreciate that you're trying to address that. I think that the answer is really door-to-door work, but if that's impossible, then that's where we are. And the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition is working hard to make sure that people are informed, and we are glad to try to continue doing that, but it would help if there was more of that effort. In this community, we have a lot of educated, very savvy political people, and I hope that the policymakers will look at what's right and really take the value of equity extremely seriously, because that is the legacy that we have to undo, the inequitable racism that zoning has caused, and the hardship with housing for primarily Black people and Latino people who have been disadvantaged so severely in the past. And I didn't see an outcry when Dairy Central was being planned. There were a lot of concerned people, but they weren't the people who were vocal tonight. And people have allowed things to happen to the majority Black community neighborhoods without ever speaking up. And now when there's a potential for change in your own neighborhoods, people are extremely vocal. So I hope folks will just take a look inside and really think about how they can contribute to making Charlottesville a more fair and equitable community. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Let's see. Well, there are no other steering committee hands raised. I know you all may have additional comments as you mull on this further. I welcome you to send me or send LaToya an email with those comments. We're happy to receive them.
And Jenny, sorry, we're also capturing comments from the steering committee in the chat box. There's a few that have come in as others have been speaking. So if you can't speak for some reason, or we don't get to you, please feel free to leave something in the chat. We are recording that as well.
And that'll be part of the notes. Ron, if you want to go through the slides here, we'll just wrap up and then we'll have some time for some additional questions. Thank you. So if you go one more back, sorry. So just to reiterate, we do have ongoing engagement through this month. There is one more webinar on the 25th, and there is a recorded webinar from the 10th as well. I would encourage you all to share the comment form and the interactive map. And if, we're happy to get flyers in your hands and other materials if those are things that you would find useful. So please feel free to reach out to, again, LaToya or I, and we will work to get you what you need. Let's see, I got two hands raised. Sunshine, did you have a comment about this?
I don't want to preempt, but I did want to make sure that we're all clear on what the next steps are as far as revisions on the plan, mostly because, as has been raised and as you've been hearing, there's been, a variety of opinions from multiple perspectives.
Yes.
And I would expect what is the plan for next versions, and do you anticipate one or two or X number of versions additionally of the plan as it gets refined? That's one question, and I'll save something else for a moment later.
Sure, thank you. Since we skipped over that next step slide, that didn't trigger in my head. So we are working, obviously we're gathering comments for this month, and then we will be providing, as we have for the previous engagement phases, a summary, as well as we'll be providing sort of the raw data where we can from the mapping exercise and the survey as well. So we'll compile what we've heard, and then we have a work session with the Planning Commission planned for 29th of June. And so at that point, we'll be bringing, we'll share before that with the Planning Commission and the rest of the community the summary of what we've heard. And then we will have a discussion with the Planning Commission about the next steps. We know we'll be making revisions to the map. I cannot say right now what they are. As you said, we're hearing comments across the board. And so there will need to be a weighing of different priorities and how well they address the goals of the process. So that is the next step, is that Planning Commission discussion. And that will be informative, I think, about number of iterations or whatnot that may happen. Let's see here. Peter, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I think that what's next is like the question I get the most, and I really it makes my life harder not having a good answer to that, and so I I'm glad that there will be some kind of revision process. I would say, as a steering committee member, like to the extent that I have influence, I think it's really important to digest the wisdom that you get and then come back to the public. I mean, because we've had basically a month of robust discussion about like really substantive stuff. And like a month is like the barest minimum. So I'll just be super interested to hear, like, I don't envy the job of digesting all this, but I think iteration and showing people they've been heard rather than just saying we're hearing people really is what leads to a good discussion. So thanks for the good work so far.
Thanks, Peter. Let's see. All right. Well, I think we have gone through the slides that we have. Oh, Sunshine, did you have a comment?
Yeah, sorry, just one quick follow-up. Thanks. I think that having seen this exercise in other cities that I've lived in, one of the things that gets lost in the translation is that change is constant, and people have this assumption that their neighborhoods are a thing and have always been that thing, which is fundamentally not true. And you know, one of the changes that we are seeing across the city, regardless of the form of the city, one of the real changes is the dramatic increase in cost of living in the city. And that's a fundamental change that the plan itself can't be the tool that solves that on its own, but it is an ingredient in that tool set. And you know, as communities are confronting the possibility of guided change, which is what we're talking about here, I think it's important to take a deep breath and recognize that change is a constant no matter what, and that this process is about guiding change to envision a city that works for everybody. And I just want to echo some of the comments that I've heard from Emily and Valerie and Lisa around that this city has not worked for many people in this community for generations. And the process of guiding change into a future city that works for everybody means by definition that there are some neighborhoods who are not accustomed to having guided change go beyond the ways that they themselves define it. It's by necessity we have to have the courage as a community to take some leaps here. So I just want to echo all that. This is a moment in time, I think, for this community. You know, it's been coming up on 4 years since 2017, when the veil of how many people saw this city was torn back, and we have to use this time as a way to address the history of racist policy that has created the city that we have today. So I think, and that's going to take courage on individual community members' parts. It's going to take courage on the neighborhood's parts, and it's going to take courage on the elected officials and planning commission parts to push forward a vision that is uncomfortable for some and supports others in sort of an inverse tradition to what had happened previously.
Sunshine. Well, I know some of you may need to depart. I know we're at 7:45 at this point, so I appreciate you sticking around until now. I do want to give, there are 4 folks who have had their hands raised for a while in the audience. I do want to give them a chance to provide their comments. I think we will stay on and record until 8. So we will fit in as many of those comments as we can. Steering committee, if you can stay, please do. Otherwise, I will make sure that that you know where to find the recording if you'd like to listen to the comments later. That being said, let's see, Ron, do you want to go to the next slide? Just have the contact info up. Cool, thanks. All right, let's see. Kimber Hockey. Oops, sorry, I'm going to bring you off of mute. 1 second. So you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, ma'am. Hi, how are you, Jennifer?
Hi, doing well, thanks.
I'm not sure if this is really the time to go through some various concerns that I have heard around the neighborhood of Belmont Carlton. Would it be more appropriate to email those specific concerns to you? And then I could just talk about a couple overriding things.
Sure, let's do that. And I'm happy to share those with the steering committee as well.
Yeah, okay, because I don't want to, take long. I think one of the big things that I've heard and that's been brought up here is this whole issue of the problem of the pandemic and the lack of public consciousness of what's going on, the process and the impact and what the timeline is, what the process is, and just in general, like what's going on. And so there has been some an idea or request to push out that date for public input. Is that anything that can be considered?
We have talked about that, and we haven't made a final decision on that, but it's something we're considering. We will likely keep the date of that work session with the Planning Commission, but it's certainly possible that we may consider whether it makes sense to adjust that date. So it's not something we've shut the door on. We're still figuring out the best path forward.
And I think probably that's the biggest one, that the most general one, and all the other stuff I'll send to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kimber. Let's see, Elizabeth Sloan, you're next here. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you all for your work. I happen to be a resident of Charlottesville, of Charlottesville in the Lewis Mountain neighborhood. I would like to say that the Lewis Mountain neighborhood does support zoning changes. It's just that these changes are radical. A land use map is a very abstract concept. The changes in this draft are radical. I sincerely hope that you will consider adjusting the changes for public, allowing the time frame to allow more public input. People just have no idea what is happening. This is huge. It's a tremendous change. You're taking my neighborhood, which currently has mixed use in it, and switching it to medium high density. Tremendous change. But I also am very concerned about the neighborhoods that are historically Black, African-American, 10th and Page in particular, because I don't know if people really have wrapped their heads around the fact that your change from R1 is to 3 units. This is going to destroy that neighborhood. We just have to have more public input. And I also want to repeat that I would like to see some 3-dimensional mapping that could be distributed to the neighborhoods in a flyer so they really understand the kind of changes you're talking about. Thank you for the work that you all are doing. I appreciate your commitment to this process.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to take all the comments now to go through them, but we'll be providing some responses, please, in the notes. So I just want to know, we're not ignoring your comments. I just want to make sure we have time to hear from everyone. Let's see, Anthony, I'm going to unmute. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. I also want to thank the team for all the hard work and thoughtful effort that has gone into this. Mostly I'm echoing comments that have been made. I also am a resident of Lewis Mountain neighborhood. I am concerned about going all the way from single family to 12-unit properties, in the neighborhood as a single jump change across the entire neighborhood. One of the principles that's stated in the document guiding this exercise is to maintain and enhance the distinct identity of the neighborhood. And moving to 12 units across every property in the neighborhood as the base zoning, or up to 12 units, it's hard for me to understand how it's going to maintain and enhance the distinct identity here. Now, I also have been talking with our neighbors here. There is a lot of support at increasing the density in the neighborhood, creating up to 3 units on properties, increasing ADUs. We would welcome that. I would welcome that. I think there's opportunity for mixed use node on development along Ivy, much denser sort of development in the Foods for All Nations shopping center there, with residential above it and additional commercial. I would welcome that as well. So I'd echo the comments to say, let's slow the process down. Let's have more neighborhood by neighborhood engagement and planning and review. I think that it would be much better for the city. I understand the historic inequities that are trying to be addressed. If there can be some plans that are developed that have consensus and a sense of support from the neighborhoods across the city, that would be much better for the health and transformation of Charlottesville than a plan that was viewed by too many as being too hasty and forced upon some neighborhoods. So I would ask the team to consider that.
Thank you, Anthony. Let's see. William Abramson, let's see, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Good evening, and yes, thank you to everyone on the call for your time and attention. I am on the board of the Fry Springs Neighborhood Association, and from our perspective, it's not. Again, we are very much supportive of this plan. I say we, the board anyway, and many of the residents. It's the how. We want to talk about how to move this forward and how to make this a wonderful thing that we see, bring out the wonderful values we see in this map. Especially when we run up against the topography, the infrastructure, the restricted budgets that have already been mentioned. So I just want to add that support. A couple specific things on the map I see. There are some green areas that have been highlighted in and around Johnson Village and Cherry Avenue. Those are homeowner association owned properties, and a couple of them at best are drainage gullies. Those should not be qualified as green space. They are not, cannot be assumed to be there in the future. And so they're kind of misleading. And if you take those away, you see how little green area is to the southwest of Forest Hills Park. I really hope that this map, for as radical as it could be and should be identifying parcels or zones with city can target areas for green space acquisition, new parks, and expand the tree canopy to meet those goals. The incredibly dense urban core along Jefferson Park Avenue and Fontaine Avenue has no green space. Yes, O Hill is nearby, but that's a county UVA thing that is under no city control, and the city should be able to take care of its residents without assuming that UVA or the county's amenities will be there in perpetuity. The last, on a related note, and this is my last point, is about multimodal connectivity. What do we want to be in this city? This plan can help provide a key for those future discussions. We need to show a connected greenway from McIntyre Park to Tonsler so that kids can ride their bike to the skate park. How do we create additional pedestrian connectivity across the railroad track so that we can bring Cherry Avenue and the university into closer dialogue? Yes, those things are big lifts. They can take a long time, but we have a new partner in the state regarding the railroad. There's new opportunities, and if we can point the path of this, I really hope you do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 more hands raised, and then we'll stick with those, and then we'll close up for the night. Sarah, I'm going to, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, this is Sarah Malpass. I'm with the Fifeville Neighborhood Association, and Mr. Abramson, I'd love to find a way to connect with you at some point. I wanted to just echo and underscore a few comments that have been made that I think are really critical. First, I want to thank the steering committee member who raised the issue of where are the map overlays of areas that were redlined against this current draft land use map. And I'd like to also ask that we create a map that shows an overlay of where there are homes with restrictive covenants against this map, so that folks can clearly understand what's being discussed when we talk about the racialized history of discrimination in this community, and the ways in which this land use map might begin to help redress some of that. I also just want to echo the comments that were made by Emily and by Sunshine. The Fifeville Neighborhood Association is in deep discussion about how this land use map does and does not, in some places, serve the goals that we laid out in the Cherry Avenue Small Area Plan. But we are thrilled and excited that the conversation is happening about racial equity, and we want to make sure that that continues. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. And our last comment from the evening will be Benjamin Heller. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, thanks for all your work on this project. I wanted to just comment on something I heard about, making sure that this plan helps people here who are already here who have been disadvantaged in the past. And I come at this from the context of having gone through a similar process over a decade ago in another city that also, thought that they could solve some of these problems by upzoning and getting rid of R1. And the result was a densification that simply attracted more new residents, and particularly high-income new residents, and wound up, if anything, damaging affordability. So at the end of 10 years, we were left with more densification that was not served by additional infrastructure, lower affordability, and then we were back at the beginning of this process again about how we were going to deal with housing affordability. So how do you make sure, or I want to make sure that you take into account the aim that I think Sunshine was talking about helping people who were disadvantaged by zoning in the past and where affordability is a problem, simply rather than simply turbocharging growth that is not accommodated in the way that maybe some of the growth we've had, which has been slow, I guess, has not been accommodated.
Thank you, Benjamin. As with the other comments, we'll be happy to provide some responses to those. I think a lot of good points were raised. So thank you, everyone. I know you hung out with your hands up for a while. I appreciate that. And thank you to the steering committee members who are still here as well as those who had to leave. That's totally fine. As usual, we'll be sharing a recording of this meeting, and we'll also post the notes from the meeting, along with, again, like I said, the responses to the comments. So thank you again, everyone. You know how to reach us. Feel free to send additional comments our way. We'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the consultant team for all your work. We know this is a marathon and not a sprint, and just really appreciate your efforts and your endurance with us.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate it. Have a good night, everyone.